Today's reading is the Laughing Bird Psalm 50, 1 through 6. You, Lord, are the mighty God. Wherever the sun shines, from horizon to horizon, you call the earth to attention. From the spectacular beauty of your holy mountain, you approach us in a blaze of glory. You come with the full fanfare, flashes of fire in front of you, thunder storming all around you. You call the earth and sky to sit as a jury and set out the charges against your people. You call the accused, those who swore faithfulness to you and signed themselves to a binding alliance. The whole universe honors you as the judge and affirms the honesty of your court. The scripture reading today is Mark 9, verses 2 through 9 from the New Revised Standard Version. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His clothes became a dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. And then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He didn't know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of God had risen from the dead.
So for the last, 3-4 weeks, we have been talking about the early days of Jesus' ministry and how it seems like he wanted to keep his identity secret. And every time he performs a miracle or heals someone from an illness or sets somebody free from an unclean spirit, he always says, "Don't tell anybody about this." It's frustrating for his disciples, I imagine, because it's obvious to them that he's the Messiah. But he keeps telling them to keep quiet about all these things, especially to the religious leaders. So last week we entertained the notion that if he didn't keep his identity secret, he would be overwhelmed with people wanting to be healed. In fact, we discovered that he couldn't even get away to practice some good self-care because his disciples tracked him down and pestered him about how many people needed healing. So this week, we're going to jump all the way to chapter 9, which may seem kind of jarring because it took us 3 weeks to not even get through chapter 1. But the event that Gary read about today is most often referred to as the Transfiguration. Now, it's a significant milestone in Jesus' ministry and also in the life of the church, because every year the lectionary gives us this scripture on the Sunday before Lent. And yes, Lent is starting this week, believe it or not. Bible scholars call this story that Gary read a transitional story because from this point on, Jesus' ministry starts shifting towards Jerusalem, where he will eventually be tried and crucified. So last week, we read about Jesus trying to get away from the crowds so that he could get away and have some quiet time. But yet, Simon Peter, of course, it's got to be Simon Peter, led a bunch of people to hunt him down and bring him back to the crowds. You know, thanks a lot, guys. And then later on in chapter 6, Jesus tried to get his disciples to take some time off with him, but things didn't work out as well as he had hoped for in this little endeavor here. The disciples were just getting back from this really difficult solo mission that Jesus sent them out on. And when they came back, Jesus saw how tired they were. And Mark writes, he said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourself and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat." Jesus' plan was to take them on a boat ride to a deserted place so that they could eat and rest. But that didn't work out so well because the crowds were so desperate for Jesus' healing that they followed along on the shore of the lake, so that when the boat stopped, Jesus got out of the boat, and Mark writes, as Jesus went to shore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Once again, the retreat was thwarted, but once again, Jesus had compassion on the crowds. So in today's lesson, Jesus took his 3 closest disciples to a high mountain. Now this is going to sound awful, and I apologize ahead of time for how awful this is going to sound, but it sounds like that's about the best place to go from sick people, right? Up on a mountain. That's awful, but it makes me wonder. But then, hear me out. Hear me out. I get this. I get the need to go away because sometimes I go to the mountain to get away from folks, right? Sometimes I go to Quincy, sometimes I go to Bucks Lake, Lassen National Park, because they're close by. They're within an hour or less. But a few times I've traveled even down to Death Valley. Sometimes I go up to Modoc County to the lava caves up there. Terry Thomas once said she had no idea. I don't understand you, Jesse. I don't understand how you can go camping all by yourself. How do you do that? I says, well, I load my truck full of camping gear and I point my truck that way, right? That's how I do it. But for me, I'm an introvert. Believe it or not, I'm an introvert. And so for me, this works out just fine for me. No crowds, no disciples, nobody following me. I've got 4-wheel drive on my pickup truck, just me and God. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but it's what works for me as an introvert. That being said, there is value in taking a group of people on a retreat. Jesus knew this, and that's why he took his disciples to this mountain. There is a reason that camps and conferences and outdoor ministry are so successful in our churches. How many folks here have ever been to a summer church camp? Yeah, quite a few people. Now, if you were in a room with 50 some odd disciple clergy people, the percentage of people who went to church camp would even be significantly higher. And in fact, of those clergy who went to church camp, there would be a substantial number of those clergy who would say that's where they received their call to ministry. I've been going to church camps now since 1983. I made my first confession of faith at Clydehurst Christian Ranch up in Montana, which is 5,351 feet above sea level. And I returned there for the next 2 summers. And then for 2 years during college, 2 summers during college, I represented Northwest Christian College for about 10 camps per summer. And with the exception of 2 camps that were on the Oregon coast, all of the other camps were somewhere on or near a mountain. My favorite was at the base of a mountain outside of Sisters, Oregon, called Three-Fingered Jack, which was 7,844 feet above sea level. And then for 9 years, as the Associate Regional Minister for the Christian Church in Virginia, I managed Craig Springs Camp and Retreat, elevation 2,250 feet, at the base of Potts Mountain, which was 3,820 feet. Now, here in Northern California and Nevada, our camp is outside of Auburn, up in Forest Hill, Virginia. It's called the Community of the Great Commission, and it is on Michigan Bluff, which is about 4,000 feet above sea level. Do you see a pattern here? Do you see the similarities? Because it's funny how most camps in our denomination are built on higher elevations. That's because we recognize the value and the purpose of mountains as they relate to our faith and our well-being. In the Bible, Moses received the Ten Commandments on Jebel Musa, which is also known as Mount Sinai, 7,500 feet. Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, 1,700 feet. The prophet Deborah, who is the only woman to serve as one of the 12 judges of Israel, led her troops to free the Israelites from the Canaanites on Mount Tabor, which was 1,900 feet. Now, Mount Tabor is also known as the mountain of Transfiguration, because it's the mountain that Gary read about this morning. This mountain that Jesus, Peter, James, and John went to was most likely Mount Tabor. Amazing things happen on mountains, and that's why we often refer to holy moments and religious revelations as mountaintop experiences. Peter, James, and John were with Jesus on the day that they went to Mount Tabor. And while they were there, Jesus' clothes became glistening, intensely white as no fuller on earth could bleach them. And then Moses, who was the giver of the law to the people of Israel, the ones who led them out of Egypt, out of slavery, was there on that mountain. And the prophet Elijah was there too, and they were speaking with Jesus. And Peter said, "Wow, this is awesome." Okay, he said, "Master, it is well that we are here." But he must have been excited, right? He had to have been excited. He was so moved by this holy moment that he wanted to build 3 shelters, one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And I like how Mark wrote that Peter said this because he didn't know what to say. You've got to love Peter, because he doesn't always know what to say, but you can count on him to say something anyway, right? This whole Lenten season, we're going to actually be looking at the ministry of Jesus through Peter's eyes, and I think we're going to have some fun with that. But I understand how his mind works. Sometimes he opens his mouth only to put his foot into it. I do that all the time. Anybody else in here ever do that? They even want to admit that? It happens to me all the time. But I can just imagine Peter thinking, down there in that valley, there are so many needy people following us around, and they won't leave us alone. And it's like you have to map out an escape route to get away from him. And Jesus, we're sorry. We used to hunt you down when you were trying to get away, but I've got to tell you, if this is what you were looking for when you tried to get away from it all, believe me, sign me up. This is great. Let's just stay here. And it's funny because that's what kids who go to church camp often say at the end of the week. Let's just stay here. They believe it is so much better on the mountain than it is in the valley. For a week, they get to make new friends. They get to have fun. They get to get away from parents. Sometimes they even get away from church. They learn new songs, and they learn to take time to reflect and pray and explore the stories of their faith and the teachings. It is great. And at the end of the week, they are not ready to go home. The directors and the counselors, we're ready to go home for sure, but not the campers. So we have to tell the campers the same thing that Jesus told his disciples, because Jesus told Peter they couldn't stay on that mountain because there were people who needed them in the valley. The mountain serves a purpose. It gives us a place to go where we can recharge our batteries and be ready for what awaits us in the valley. We used to sing this song on the last day of camp, actually the last evening worship of camp every year at Craig Springs, and it was a song by Stephen Curtis Chapman called The Mountain, and it's based on the Transfiguration story that Gary read. Chapman writes, "I want to build a house upon this mountain, way up high where the peaceful waters flow, to quench my thirsty soul upon the mountain. I can see for miles upon this mountain. Troubles seem so small they almost disappear. Lord, I love it here upon the mountain. My faith is strengthened by all I see. You make it easy for me to believe upon the mountain. I would love to live upon this mountain and keep the pain of living life so far away, but I know I can't stay up on the mountain. I said I'd go, Lord, wherever you lead, for where you are is where I most want to be, and I can tell we're headed for the valley. My faith is strengthened by all that I've seen, so Lord, help me remember what you've shown me upon the mountain. You bring me up here on the mountain for me to rest and learn and grow. I see the truth up on the mountain, and I carry it to the world far below. So as I go down to the valley, knowing that you will go with me, this is my prayer, Lord. Help me to remember what you showed me up on the mountain." I like how Mark and some of the other gospel writers wanted to emphasize Jesus' reluctance to go so public about his ministry. But then we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The healings that he performed were not to prove that he was the Messiah. They were to meet very specific human needs. And I believe he took his disciples to that mountain so that they could bear witness to his divine nature. The same words that God spoke to Jesus at his baptism were the ones that were spoken up on that mountain too. God said, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." It's interesting that even as they were returning to the crowds below, Mark writes, as they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Now, wait a minute, Jesus. What? Run that by us again? Risen from the dead? Because you see, this was a turning point for Jesus' ministry. Because from this point forward, Jesus would make his way toward Jerusalem, where his ministry would become more public, to the point where the religious leaders and the governing authorities would see him as a threat, and they'd collaborate to silence him. And so the focus of his ministry would shift from one of healing to one of teaching. He would challenge the rulers of this world and prepare his disciples to become ambassadors of God's reign here on earth so that they could carry on his ministry long after he was gone. He would be exposed. He would no longer be able to keep his ministry a secret. But the disciples needed that mountaintop experience to prepare them for this last third of Jesus' ministry. They needed to know that they would receive the same divine support and be able to tap into that same source of power that Jesus was able to tap into on that mountain so that they could go into all the world and show compassion for all as Jesus did. So in the same way that today's scripture is a turning point for Jesus' ministry, it's also a turning point for us as we enter into Lenten season. Because starting Wednesday, we will all be on our way to Jerusalem with the one who is called the Son, the one who is called the Beloved One. This is where we get to see what we're made out of. Lent is a season of intentional focus where we get to explore our relationship with God through Christ. Like the disciples of Jesus' time, may we, who are his disciples today, remember the lesson of the mountain as we travel back into the valley.